Elena Martinez stepped off the small transport ship and looked around. The space station was bigger than she thought it would be. Metal walls stretched in all directions, and bright lights made everything look clean and white. She carried her bag in one hand and held her research papers in the other. "Welcome to Research Station Omega-7, said a tall man walking toward her. He had short brown hair and wore a blue uniform. "I'm Jake Sullivan, the station commander. We've been waiting for you." Elena smiled and shook his hand. "Thank you. I'm excited to start working here. 6 months studying the Velkari should give me plenty of data for my research." Jake's face became serious. "About that. We need to talk. Things have gotten complicated since we sent our last report to Earth." They walked through long hallways with windows that showed the forest moon below. Elena could see tall trees that looked almost like Earth trees, but their leaves were purple instead of green. The moon looked peaceful and beautiful. "The Velkari are not what we expected," Jake said as they walked. "They're much smarter than our first report suggested, and they don't like us being here." Elena knew some things about the Velkari from her studies. They looked like large wolves but walked on 2 legs. They had thick fur, sharp teeth, and were about 7 feet tall. They lived in groups called packs, just like wolves on Earth. Jake led her to a room with big screens on the walls. A woman with long black hair was looking at the screens. She turned when they came in. "This is Dr. Lisa Chen, our lead researcher," Jake said. "Lisa, this is Dr. Elena Martinez." Lisa shook Elena's hand but looked worried. "I'm glad you're here. We really need help understanding what's happening." Elena looked at the screens. They showed pictures of the forest below. She could see large, furry creatures moving between the trees. "Are those the Velkari?" "Yes," Lisa said. "That pack has been living in this area for about 2 years. The big one there is the leader. We call him Thornback because of the spikes on his back." Elena watched Thornback on the screen. He was huge, even bigger than the other Velkari. His fur was dark gray, and he moved with the confidence of a leader. When he looked up at the camera, Elena could see intelligence in his eyes. 3 weeks ago, something happened," Lisa continued. 2 adult Velkari died in a fight with another pack. They left behind 3 cubs. "Cubs?" Elena asked. "Baby Velkari. They're about the size of Earth wolves, but they're very young. Thornback's pack took them in, which is normal. But since then, the cubs have been acting strange." Lisa touched the screen, and the view changed to show 3 small, furry creatures. They were much smaller than the adults, with lighter-colored fur and big eyes. Elena thought they looked cute, like puppies. "They won't sleep," Lisa said. "They won't eat properly, and they make these sounds all day and all night." Elena could hear the sounds through the speakers. The cubs were making sad crying noises. It sounded like they were calling for something. "It's been 3 weeks," Jake said. "The sounds never stop. They're driving everyone crazy." "What makes it really strange," Lisa said, "is when this started. The cubs began acting this way right after Dr. Peter Clark left the station." "Peter Clark?" Elena asked. "He was the researcher before you," Jake explained. "He studied the Velkari for 8 months. Good scientist, very dedicated. But his wife got sick on Earth, so he had to leave quickly." Elena looked at the screens again. The cubs were standing at the edge of their territory, the area closest to the space station. They kept looking up at the sky and making their sad calls. "You think they're calling for Dr. Clark?" Elena asked. "We don't know," Lisa said. "It seems impossible. How could alien animals care about one specific human?" Elena studied the footage more carefully. The cubs stayed together, but they clearly weren't happy. Even when the adult Velkari tried to lead them away, they kept coming back to the same spot. "What does Thornback do about this?" Elena asked. "That's the strangest part," Jake said. "He's the pack leader. He should force them to obey. But he just watches them. Sometimes he looks confused, like he doesn't understand their behavior either." Elena watched Thornback on the screen. The big alien stood near the cubs but didn't try to make them move. Sometimes he looked toward the space station as if he was trying to understand what the cubs wanted. "Have you tried to communicate with them?" Elena asked. "We've sent radio signals, but they don't respond," Lisa said. "We don't know if they can even understand that the signals come from us." Elena spent the next few hours reviewing all the research data. The cubs' behavior was definitely unusual. In all the reports about Velkari, nothing like this had ever been recorded. That night, Elena lay in her small room and listened to the cubs' calls coming through the station's speakers. The sound was heartbreaking. It reminded her of lost children crying for their parents. She got up and went to the observation deck. Through the big windows, she could see the forest below. Even in the darkness, she could hear the cubs calling. Their voices carried across the night air, reaching the space station like a message she couldn't understand. "Why are you calling?" Elena whispered to herself. "What do you want?" As if they heard her, the cubs' calls became louder. Elena felt a strange feeling in her chest, like the cubs were calling to her personally. She knew that was impossible, but the feeling wouldn't go away. She decided that tomorrow she would find a way to get closer to the cubs. Maybe if she could observe them better, she would understand what they needed. Something told her this was more important than any research she had ever done before. The cubs kept calling through the night, and Elena kept listening, feeling somehow that their destinies were connected in ways she couldn't yet understand. Elena woke up early the next morning. The cubs were still calling, but their voices sounded weaker. She dressed quickly and went to the main research room. Lisa was already there, looking tired. "Did you sleep at all?" Elena asked. "Not much," Lisa said. "The calls got louder around midnight, then softer toward morning. I think the cubs are getting weaker." Elena looked at the screen showing the Velkari territory. The 3 cubs were lying on the ground near the boundary line, but they were still making their sad sounds. They looked smaller and more helpless than before. "I want to get closer to them," Elena said. Lisa looked surprised. "That's dangerous. We don't know how Thornback will react to humans getting near his territory." "I'll use the observation pod," Elena said. "It has strong shields. If there's trouble, I can get away quickly." Jake came into the room and heard their conversation. "Absolutely not," he said. "It's too risky." "Commander, those cubs are dying," Elena said. "Look at them. They're getting weaker every day. If we don't do something soon, they won't survive." Jake studied the screens. The cubs did look sick. Their fur wasn't as bright, and they moved slowly. "What do you think you can accomplish by getting closer?" he asked. "I want to see how they react to human presence," Elena said. "Maybe there's something we're missing from this distance." After an hour of discussion, Jake finally agreed. Elena would take the observation pod to the edge of Velkari territory. She would stay inside the pod and observe for 1 hour maximum. The observation pod was like a small spaceship. It had thick metal walls, cameras, and speakers. Elena climbed inside and checked all the systems. Everything worked perfectly. Dr. Ben Torres helped her with the communications equipment. "If the cubs make any sounds toward you, this will record everything," he said. "We might be able to figure out what they're trying to say." Elena piloted the pod down to the forest. As she got closer to the cubs, her heart beat faster. She had studied many alien species, but she had never been this close to living ones. The pod landed about 50 feet from the boundary line. Elena could see the cubs clearly now through the pod's windows. They were beautiful creatures, with soft fur and expressive eyes. The moment the pod touched the ground, the cubs' behavior changed completely. They jumped to their feet and ran toward the boundary. Their sad calls became excited barks and chirps. "Elena, are you seeing this?" Lisa's voice came through the radio. "Yes," Elena whispered. "They know I'm here." The cubs stopped right at the boundary line. They couldn't cross into neutral territory, but they got as close as possible to Elena's pod. They were wagging their tails and making happy sounds. Then Thornback appeared. The huge Velkari leader walked slowly toward the cubs. Elena expected him to be angry or aggressive, but he looked curious instead. Thornback stood behind the cubs and stared at Elena's pod. His head tilted to one side like he was trying to understand something. The cubs kept making excited sounds and looking back and forth between Thornback and Elena. "This is incredible." Ben's voice came through the radio. "The cubs' sounds are completely different now. They're not distressed anymore." Elena watched in amazement as the cubs started doing something that looked like playing. They jumped around each other, made happy chirping sounds, and kept looking at her pod. Then something unexpected happened. Thornback made a deep, rumbling sound. It wasn't threatening. It sounded almost like he was talking to the cubs. The cubs immediately calmed down. They sat near the boundary line, still facing Elena's pod, but they were quiet and peaceful. "Elena, you need to see this data," Ben said over the radio. "The cubs' sounds when you arrived, they're not random. There's a pattern. What kind of pattern? Elena asked. It looks like they're trying to communicate. The sounds have rhythm and structure, like language. Elena made a decision that would change everything. She opened the pod's door. Elena, no! Jake's voice shouted through the radio. Stay in the pod! But Elena was already stepping outside. She moved slowly and kept her hands visible. She didn't want to scare the Velkari. The cubs' reaction was immediate and overwhelming. They started making excited sounds again, but softer this time. They pressed against the boundary line, trying to get as close to Elena as possible. Thornback stepped forward, and Elena's heart stopped. The huge alien was even more impressive up close. He was at least 8 feet tall, with muscles that could easily tear her apart. But Thornback didn't attack. He stared at Elena for a long moment, then made that same deep, rumbling sound. This time, Elena realized it wasn't threatening. It sounded like he was thinking out loud. Elena slowly sat down on the ground. She wanted to show that she wasn't a threat. The cubs immediately copied her, sitting on their side of the boundary. For several minutes, they just looked at each other. Elena studied the cubs' faces and saw intelligence there. These weren't just animals. They were thinking, feeling beings. One of the cubs made a soft, chirping sound. Elena tried to copy the sound. The cub's ears perked up, and it made the sound again, but louder. Elena tried again. This time, all 3 cubs joined in, making a chorus of soft chirps. They seemed excited that Elena was trying to communicate. Thornback watched this exchange with obvious interest. He moved closer to the boundary, but he didn't seem aggressive. If anything, he looked curious. Then something amazing happened. The cubs lay down on their side of the boundary line. For the first time in 3 weeks, they stopped calling. They closed their eyes and went to sleep. Elena sat perfectly still, afraid to move and wake them. The cubs slept peacefully, their breathing slow and steady. Elena, Lisa's voice whispered through her radio earpiece. They're actually sleeping. Elena looked up at Thornback. The big alien was still watching her, but his posture had relaxed. He no longer looked ready to fight. Instead, he seemed to be studying Elena like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve. After 30 minutes, Elena slowly stood up. The cubs woke immediately but didn't seem distressed. They watched as Elena walked back to her pod. As she climbed inside, the cubs made soft, friendly sounds. They weren't the desperate calls from before. These sounds seemed to say goodbye and see you later. Elena piloted the pod back to the station, her mind racing. Something incredible had just happened. The cubs had responded to her presence in a way that seemed impossible. How do you explain what just happened? Jake asked when Elena returned to the station. I can't, Elena admitted. But I think the cubs have been calling for human contact. Not just any human. They specifically wanted someone to come and be with them. That's impossible, Lisa said. How could alien animals understand the difference between humans and other species? Elena thought about the cubs' intelligent eyes and their attempts to communicate. Maybe they're more like us than we realized. That night, Elena listened to the recordings of the cubs' sounds. Ben was right. There were patterns that looked like language. The cubs weren't just making noise. They were trying to talk. For the first time in weeks, the cubs slept through the night. But Elena couldn't sleep. She knew that tomorrow she would go back to them. Something had started between her and the cubs, and she needed to understand what it was. Elena began visiting the cubs every day. Each time she went to the boundary, they greeted her with excitement and joy. Their health improved quickly. They started eating again and playing like normal young animals. Dr. Amy Foster, the station's psychologist, watched the daily visits through the cameras. This is unprecedented, she told Elena. I've never seen anything like the bond you've formed with those cubs. Elena sat at the boundary line, and the cubs sat across from her. They seemed to enjoy just being near her, even with the invisible barrier between them. Sometimes they would bring her things, interesting rocks, pieces of wood, even small dead animals. They're giving you gifts, Lisa observed. That's pack behavior. They're treating you like a family member. The gifts followed patterns that Elena began to recognize. When she arrived at the station feeling happy, The cubs brought her bright, colorful stones. When she seemed sad or tired, they brought softer things like moss or leaves. How do they know how I'm feeling? Elena asked Amy. They're reading your body language, Amy explained. Humans and many earth animals communicate through posture, facial expressions, and movement. The cubs have learned to understand these signals. But Elena noticed something even more amazing. The cubs weren't just reading her emotions. They were responding to them in ways that helped her feel better. One day, Elena arrived at the boundary feeling frustrated after a difficult morning analyzing data. The cubs immediately sensed her mood. Instead of their usual excited greeting, they approached slowly and made soft, comforting sounds. One cub brought her a smooth, warm stone that had been sitting in the sunlight. Another brought her a piece of sweet-smelling bark. The third cub simply sat as close to the boundary as possible and hummed a low, peaceful sound. Elena felt her frustration melting away. The cubs were actively trying to comfort her, just like friends might do. Thornback's behavior also changed over the weeks. At first, he watched Elena's visits from a distance, but gradually he came closer. He never tried to stop the cubs from interacting with Elena. Instead, he seemed to be studying the relationship. Look at this footage from yesterday, Ben said, showing Elena a recording. Watch Thornback's body language. In the video, Elena could see herself sitting with the cubs. Thornback was nearby, but he wasn't tense or alert like a guard. His posture was relaxed, almost protective. He was guarding Elena as much as he was guarding the cubs. He's accepting you, Amy said. Somehow you've become part of his pack structure. The breakthrough came during Elena's third week of visits. She was sitting with the cubs when another Valkyrie from a different pack appeared at the edge of the territory. This stranger was smaller than Thornback, but still dangerous looking. The cubs immediately became scared. They huddled together and made distressed sounds. Elena wanted to comfort them, but the boundary line still separated them. Thornback appeared quickly and positioned himself between the stranger and his territory. But what happened next surprised everyone watching from the station. Thornback also positioned himself between the stranger and Elena. He was protecting her along with the cubs the stranger Valkyrie saw. Thornback's protective stance and left without causing trouble, but Thornback's message was clear. Elena was under his protection. He's treating you like a pack member, Amy said in amazement. You're not just a visitor anymore. You're family. Elena felt honored but also confused. How is this possible? I'm not a Valkyrie. I'm not even the same species. Maybe that doesn't matter to them, Lisa suggested. Maybe family is about relationships, not biology. The cubs began teaching Elena things about their world. They showed her which plants were safe to eat by bringing samples to the boundary. They demonstrated hunting techniques by stalking imaginary prey. They even tried to teach her their language by repeating specific sounds until she could copy them. Elena learned that different sounds meant different things. A high chirp meant happy. A low rumble meant safe. A sharp bark meant pay attention. The cubs seemed delighted when Elena used these sounds correctly. But the most amazing discovery came when Elena realized the cubs were showing her pack hierarchy and social rules. They demonstrated how to show respect to an alpha, how to ask permission, and how to settle disputes peacefully. They're not just bonding with you, Amy observed. They're trying to integrate you into their society. Elena began to understand that the cubs saw her as more than just a friend. In their minds, she was a strange kind of Valkyrie who needed to learn how to be part of the pack. The other researchers were fascinated by Elena's progress, but they also worried about her safety. Spending hours every day at the boundary line was consuming all her time and energy. You're supposed to be studying them from a scientific perspective, Jake reminded her, but you're becoming emotionally involved. Elena knew Jake was right, but she couldn't help herself. The cubs needed her and she needed them too. Each day with them felt like the most important work she had ever done. One evening, Elena was reviewing her notes when Ben burst into her room with urgent news. I just received a message from Earth Command, he said. There are budget cuts coming. Your assignment is being shortened. Elena felt her heart stop. What do you mean shortened? Instead of 6 months, you only have 1 more week here. Then you have to return to Earth. Elena stared at Ben in shock. 1 week? That's impossible. I can't leave the cubs now. I'm sorry, Elena, the orders came directly from headquarters. There's nothing we can do. Elena spent that night thinking about the cubs and what would happen to them when she left. They had just started to recover from losing their original parents. How would they handle losing her too? She remembered their condition when she first arrived: sick, scared, and refusing to eat or sleep. If she left now, would they return to that state? Would they survive another abandonment? The next morning, Elena went to the Boundary as usual, but she felt terrible inside. The cubs greeted her with their usual joy, not knowing that their time together was almost over. As she sat with them, Elena made a decision that would change her life forever. She couldn't leave the cubs. Whatever the consequences, she had to find a way to stay. The cubs had taught her that family bonds were stronger than rules or regulations. They had shown her that love could exist between completely different species. Now it was her turn to show them the same kind of loyalty they had given her. Elena looked at the 3 cubs sleeping peacefully by the boundary line. They trusted her completely. She couldn't betray that trust, no matter what Earth Command ordered her to do. Tomorrow she would have to tell Jake about her decision. She would have to find a way to stay with her new family, even if it meant giving up everything else she had ever worked for. Elena told Jake about her decision the next morning. His reaction was exactly what she expected. "Absolutely not," he said firmly. "You cannot disobey direct orders from Earth Command. You'll be court-martialed." "Jake, you've seen what happens to the cubs when humans leave," Elena argued. "They almost died when Dr. Clark left. If I abandon them now, they won't survive." Lisa joined the conversation, looking worried. "Elena, I understand how you feel about the cubs, but you have to think about your career. Your whole future." "What future?" Elena asked. "If I let those cubs die, how could I live with myself?" Dr. Carl Peterson, the station's medical officer, had been monitoring the cubs' health. "Elena's right about one thing," he said. "When I compare their current health to 3 weeks ago, the difference is dramatic. They were dying before she started visiting them." Amy nodded in agreement. The psychological bond between Elena and the cubs is real. Severing it suddenly could cause severe trauma, but Jake remained firm. "I understand the emotional attachment, but we can't ignore military orders. Elena has 3 days to prepare for departure. That's final." Elena spent those 3 days trying to find alternatives. She researched regulations, contacted her supervisors on Earth, and even tried to get extensions through medical necessity claims. Nothing worked. Meanwhile, the cubs seemed to sense that something was wrong. Elena tried to act normally during her visits, but they picked up on her distress. They became more clingy, more desperate to interact with her. On the second day, the cubs started bringing Elena more gifts than ever before. They seemed to be trying to convince her to stay by showing how much they valued her presence. Thornback also began acting strangely. The big alpha spent more time near the boundary, watching Elena's visits. Sometimes he would make those deep, rumbling sounds that Elena had learned meant he was thinking hard about something. "Look at this behavior," Amy said, reviewing the footage. "Thornback knows something is wrong. He's trying to figure out what's happening." The worst moment came on Elena's final night. She went to the boundary to say goodbye to the cubs, though she couldn't bring herself to tell them it was the last time. The cubs greeted her as enthusiastically as always, but as the evening went on, their behavior changed. They seemed to understand that this visit was different. When Elena stood to leave, the cubs became agitated. They pressed against the boundary line and made urgent sounds. One of them started the heartbreaking crying sounds that Elena remembered from her first day. "No, don't cry," Elena whispered, fighting back her own tears. "I'll see you tomorrow." But the cubs didn't believe her. All 3 began making distressed calls. Within minutes, their cries had returned to the desperate, heartbreaking sounds that had kept the station awake for weeks. Elena returned to the station, with her heart breaking. Through her window, she could hear the cubs calling all night long. They knew she was leaving. The next morning brought terrible news. Carl reported that the cubs had stopped eating again. They had spent the entire night at the boundary line calling for Elena. "Their behavior is worse than when Dr. Clark left," Carl said. "They're showing signs of severe psychological distress." Elena went to the boundary one last time. The cubs looked terrible. Their eyes were dull, their fur was messy, and they moved slowly. But when they saw Elena, they summoned enough energy to come to the boundary line. This time, Thornback came with them. The huge alpha stood directly behind the cubs and stared at Elena. His expression was unlike anything she had seen before. He looked confused, frustrated, and even desperate. Thornback made a sound Elena had never heard from him before. It was low and rumbling, but it had a pleading quality. He was asking Elena for something, but she didn't know what. "Elena," Ben's voice came through her radio. "You need to hear this." Thornback's vocalizations are showing patterns similar to the Cubs' communication attempts. "What does that mean?" Elena asked. "I think he's trying to talk to you. He's asking you not to leave." Elena stared at Thornback in amazement. The Alpha, who had once seen her as a potential threat, was now begging her to stay. Somehow she had become important to him too. The Cubs made soft, pleading sounds. They looked at Elena with such trust and love that she felt her heart breaking all over again. Elena made her decision. She activated her radio and spoke to Jake. "Commander, I'm formally requesting asylum with the Velkari Pack." "Elena, what are you talking about?" Jake's voice crackled through the radio. "According to interspecies sovereignty laws, if an alien species accepts a human as a member, that human can claim protection under their jurisdiction." There was silence on the radio. Then Jake's voice came back, very serious. "Elena, that law has never been tested. You could be throwing away your entire life." "My life doesn't mean anything if I abandon my family," Elena replied. Elena sat down at the boundary line and spoke to the Cubs in their own language, using the sounds they had taught her. She told them she was staying, that she would never leave them. The Cubs' relief was immediate and overwhelming. They stopped their distressed calls and made happy chirping sounds. They brought Elena gifts and tried to touch her hands through the invisible barrier. Thornback's reaction was the most surprising. The huge Alpha made a sound that Elena had learned meant approval or agreement. He was accepting Elena's decision to join his pack. But Elena's troubles were just beginning. Within hours, Earth Command sent an emergency message. Dr. Kevin Murphy, Elena's mentor and head of the Xenobiological Research Division, was coming to the station immediately. "He's not coming to support you," Jake warned Elena. "He's coming to bring you back to Earth, willingly or not." Elena spent that night at the boundary line with the Cubs. She didn't care about regulations anymore. If these were her last hours with them, she wanted to spend them together. The Cubs seemed to understand the seriousness of the situation. They stayed awake all night, keeping Elena company. Even Thornback remained nearby, as if standing guard over his new pack member. As dawn broke, Elena saw a transport ship approaching the station. Dr. Murphy had arrived. In a few hours, she would have to defend her decision to the one person whose opinion mattered most to her career. But looking at the Cubs sleeping peacefully beside the boundary line, Elena felt no regret. She had made the right choice. Now she had to convince Dr. Murphy that love and loyalty were more important than rules and regulations. The Cubs had refused to rest until she arrived, and now Elena refused to leave until she knew they would be safe. Whatever happened next, she would face it with her new family beside her, even if an invisible boundary still separated them. Elena touched the boundary line with her hand. On the other side, one of the Cubs placed its paw against the same spot. They couldn't touch, but the connection between them was stronger than any physical barrier. Soon, she would learn whether that connection was strong enough to change the rules that kept them apart. Dr. Kevin Murphy arrived on the station with a serious expression and a briefcase full of official documents. Elena had worked with him for 5 years, and she had never seen him look so stern. "Elena, what do you think you're doing?" he asked as soon as he stepped off the transport ship. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you're in?" "Hello, Kevin," Elena said calmly. "I'm doing what I think is right." Kevin shook his head. "You're throwing away a brilliant career for some emotional attachment to alien animals. This isn't like you." Jake led them to the main conference room. Kevin spread out official papers on the table. "These are your transfer orders. You're coming back to Earth with me today." "I'm claiming asylum with the Velkari Pack," Elena said firmly. "I have that right under interspecies sovereignty laws." Kevin laughed bitterly. "Elena, those laws exist in theory only. No human has ever tried to use them. You have no legal standing." "Then I'll be the first to test them," Elena replied. Kevin looked frustrated. "At least show me what's so important that you're willing to risk everything." Elena led Kevin to the observation deck. Through the windows, they could see the Cubs at the boundary line. The 3 young Velkari were playing together, healthy and happy. "They look like normal alien animals to me," Kevin said dismissively. "Watch," Elena said. She activated the communication system and made the chirping sound that meant hello in Velkari language. Immediately, all three cubs looked up at the station. They recognized Elena's voice even through the speakers. They ran to the boundary line and began making excited, happy sounds. Kevin frowned. Trained responses. Many animals can be taught to recognize human sounds. Elena activated the system again and made the sound that meant, "I'm sad." The cubs' behavior changed instantly. They made soft, comforting sounds and brought gifts to the boundary line. "Now watch this," Elena said. She made the sound for "I'm happy." The cubs began playing and making joyful noises. Kevin stared at the screen. "They're responding to your emotional state?" "It goes deeper than that," Elena said. "They're not just responding. They're trying to help me feel better when I'm sad, and they share my joy when I'm happy." Amy joined them and showed Kevin weeks of recorded data. "Dr. Murphy, this is unprecedented interspecies emotional communication. The cubs have formed genuine bonds with Elena. And it's not just the cubs," Lisa added, pointing to another screen. "Look at Thornback." On the screen, the massive alpha Valkyrie was visible near the cubs. As they watched, Thornback looked directly at the station camera and made a deep rumbling sound. "He knows Elena is up here," Ben explained. "He's learned to recognize her presence even when she's not at the boundary." Kevin studied the data for an hour. His expression gradually changed from skepticism to amazement. This communication level. "I've never seen anything like it." "There's more," Elena said. "Let me show you in person." Despite Jake's concerns about safety, Kevin agreed to accompany Elena to the boundary line. They took the observation pod down to the forest. The moment Elena stepped out of the pod, the cubs' reaction was immediate and overwhelming. They rushed to the boundary line, making excited sounds and trying to get as close to Elena as possible. Kevin stepped out behind Elena. The cubs noticed him immediately but showed no fear. Instead, they looked curiously at the new human. Then Thornback appeared. Kevin instinctively stepped back when he saw the massive alien, but Elena remained calm. "Watch Thornback's body language," Elena said quietly. "He's not aggressive." Thornback approached the boundary line and studied Kevin carefully. The alpha made several different sounds, each with a different tone. "He's communicating," Kevin whispered in amazement. "He's actually trying to talk to us." Elena sat down at the boundary line and the cubs immediately mirrored her position. Kevin watched in fascination as Elena and the cubs exchanged a series of sounds that clearly had meaning. "What are you saying to them?" Kevin asked. "I'm telling them that you're my friend, and that you're here to learn about them," Elena explained. One of the cubs made a questioning sound and tilted its head toward Kevin. Elena responded with a series of chirps and rumbles. "Now I'm telling them that you're the leader of my pack on Earth," Elena said. Thornback's reaction to this information was remarkable. The huge alpha stepped closer to the boundary and made a formal-sounding rumble toward Kevin. "I think he just greeted you as an equal," Elena said with a smile. "Alpha to alpha." Kevin spent the next 2 hours observing Elena's interactions with the cubs. He saw them communicate, play, and show genuine affection across the species barrier. But the most convincing moment came when Elena had to return to the pod. The cubs became visibly distressed, making pleading sounds and pressing against the boundary line. Elena spoke to them in their language, explaining that she would return tomorrow. The cubs calmed down, but they remained at the boundary line, watching until the pod disappeared. "They trust her completely," Kevin said quietly. "She's not just studying them. She's part of their family." Back at the station, Kevin spent the evening reviewing all of Elena's research. The data was undeniable. Elena had achieved something that science had thought impossible: true interspecies emotional bonding. "Elena," Kevin said finally, "what you've accomplished here could change everything about how we interact with alien species. Does that mean you'll support my asylum request?" Elena asked hopefully. Kevin was quiet for a long moment. "What if there was another way? What if we could establish a permanent research position here? You could stay with the cubs and continue your work officially." Elena felt her heart leap. "Is that possible?" "It would take some negotiating with Earth Command, but yes. What you've discovered here is too important to abandon. The scientific community needs to study this bonding phenomenon." Kevin contacted Earth Command and spent hours in discussions with military and scientific leaders. Elena waited anxiously, listening to the cubs' peaceful sounds through the station speakers. Finally, Kevin emerged from his communications with good news. Earth Command has agreed to establish a permanent xenobiological research station here. You'll be the lead researcher, with a team of specialists to support you." Elena felt tears of relief and joy. "Thank you, Kevin. You don't know what this means to me." "I think I do," Kevin said with a smile. "You found something that most scientists only dream of. A genuine connection with an alien species. We're not going to let bureaucracy destroy that." The next morning, Elena went to the boundary line with the best news of her life. Using the Cubs' language, she told them that she was staying permanently. The Cubs' joy was infectious. They danced, chirped, and brought Elena every gift they could find. Even Thornback showed pleasure, making approving sounds, and what Elena had learned was the Velkari equivalent of a smile. 6 months later, Elena had established the most successful interspecies communication program in human history. The Cubs, now grown into young adults, continued to serve as bridges between human and Velkari culture. Thornback had fully accepted Elena as a pack member, including her in territory decisions and pack meetings. Other Velkari packs had begun to show interest in communicating with humans, using Elena's pack as an example. Most importantly, Elena had learned that family bonds could transcend any barrier, species, language, or physical separation. The Cubs had refused to rest until the human arrived, because they understood something that even the Alpha didn't initially comprehend. Love, loyalty, and family weren't limited by biology. They were choices that any intelligent being could make, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. Elena sat at the boundary line, now expanded to include a small building where she lived and worked. The Cubs, now confident young adults, brought their own cubs to meet their human pack member. The invisible barrier between species had finally been broken, not by technology or force, but by the simple recognition that family is defined not by genes, but by the willingness to care for each other unconditionally. Elena looked at the newest generation of cubs playing near the boundary and smiled. They would grow up in a world where humans and Velkari were no longer strangers, but friends and family. The cubs' refusal to rest had changed everything, creating a future where understanding and love could bridge any gap between different worlds and different species.